Hi everyone. For this mini lecture segment, we're going to be looking at specific ethical issues, especially in research with children and youth. Okay, so now we're going to talk about consent and assent. So the ethics of consent is that participants in research must provide consent to participate in a research project. Consent is one of the central components of research ethics in any research with humans, and it is more of a procedural question, and all research ethics boards applications will require that the researchers address how they will gain consent, so either whether it's verbal, written, or even gestured. And when doing research with children and youth, we have to think about parental guardian consent. So for most projects, if the participants are under 18, they do need parental or guardian consent before they can agree to participate in the project. However, it is important to note that this rule can sometimes change depending on the project and the circumstances surrounding it. So, for some certain populations of young people, parental or guardian consent may not be required. An example would be for minimal risk research involving participants 16 years of age and older. Sometimes parental consent isn't always required. Some other examples would be if researchers may actually request for parental consent to be waived if they're studying sensitive or stigmatized participants, such as focusing on studies that look at like substance abuse or sexual activity or gender identity in youth. One specific study was one that focused on the health of LGBTQ youth, and the researcher felt it was important that the 16 and 17-year-olds he was studying should be allowed to participate without their parents' permission. Since many of the potential participants weren't open with their parents about their sexuality or sexual activity. So in this case, he was able to get a waiver of the parental permission. However, he does mention that it was a little bit hard to manage, and it was hard for him to get this approved, and it took some time and some discussion with the research ethics board to have this approved. So I guess that just points to the fact that it's not always easy. Next is child assent. So more recently has become seen as important to acquire agreement from the child participants, even for very small children. Assent is the process where, a young person makes a decision about whether or not they want to participate. Some people do not think that the word consent is the right word to use because by law children are not considered to have the capacity to consent, so they use the word assent instead, which just suggests agreement. There can be challenges of parent consent and child assent because we need both of them. For an example, if children don't want to participate and their parents provide consent and they kind of feel pressured to, or it can be vice versa where the child wants to participate and they want to provide assent but their parent doesn't provide consent. In the Hung et al. Article, they mentioned some of these challenges, and they mentioned that children need to assent without feeling pressured from their parents or other adults, and some of the researchers felt that this was difficult for them to make sure that the children had given assent freely, and this can be the case in studies where the parents are always present. So I think this is why it is important to ensure that the researcher always asks the child themselves to ensure that the child does want to participate and not only just rely on permission from the parents. Another challenge they mentioned in the article was that some parents may not pass the information on about the study to their child, and therefore some children do not get the opportunity to participate in the study. So when doing research with children and youth, getting consent from the parents and assent from the child can sometimes be challenging. An important part of consent and assent is that it needs to be informed. And what this means is that participants must know what they are getting into and they must be able to leave the research at any time. So informed consent pretty much means that the researcher is explaining what the research is about, what will happen in the research, how the participant is able to withdraw, whether the information that they're giving is kept confidential, and what will be done with the research. This can be done by providing an information sheet, which is often done with older children and adults, or sometimes the researcher will provide the information sheet and on top of that verbally explain the project. There are many strategies that can be used with children, and some researchers have created pamphlets or books with images to inform the children about the study. This isn't the case if it's really young children and they may not be able to read yet. You can introduce the study and inform them about the details through these different types of methods. Some researchers have also created games. So, say it's a game with cards and there's images on the cards. When they flip them, the image will lead to a discussion about a certain part of the research. It's also important that the researchers include on forums, if it's on information forums, that they're telling the participants you do not have to join this study. It is totally up to you. It's okay if you change your mind later. If you decide to participate now and change your mind later, you're allowed to withdraw. And it's important that they remind them that they're not going to be mad if the participants decide they don't want to join the study or they don't want to be a part of it anymore. And then this leads to ongoing consent and assent. So this is important for projects because researchers need to remember that they need to continuously be sure that they're making it clear that the participant doesn't have to continue with the study if they don't want to. Researchers need to do things such as slow down and pay attention to nonverbal hints, and also remind participants that, they can do things such as skip questions or take breaks if they are feeling uncomfortable or don't feel like participating any further. Some researchers give children, when they're doing interviews, they give them the voice recorder and show them how they're allowed to turn it off. So if a child feels they don't want to participate anymore, they have the control to just shut off the voice recorder, which is also another strategy that some of them use. In my experiences with my project, some of the time the children just wanted to go and play when it was time for an interview. So, I had to respect their choice and be flexible to ensure that they were only participating when they wished to do so. There's other methods that some participants use in longitudinal studies, such as having a board for children that has a thumbs up and a thumbs down. Thumbs up meaning that they want to participate, thumbs up meaning that they don't, and every time the researcher's there, they can go place their picture or their name under the thumbs up or the thumbs down, and that way they don't have to actually tell the researcher if they don't feel comfortable, and the researcher can look at the board and decide that way. So next we'll talk about gatekeeper consent. So gatekeepers play an important role in research conducted with children and youth. And gatekeepers are other people who make decisions about whether or not children can participate in research. Not only do researchers need consent from parents and guardians before asking children, they also need or may need informed consent from organizations. It's depending on where the research is taking place. So for an example, if the research is going to take place inside of a school, you may need permission from the school board, the school teachers, or if it was in a childcare center, you may need consent from the director of the childcare center and then the supervisor and maybe the early childhood educators. In the Huang et al. Article, they also talk about this, and they mention some of the challenges when working with the gatekeepers. So they suggest that maybe sometimes organizations have different interests and investments than the researchers, and they may not want the research done if they feel it will make their organization look bad, or they may not want the research done if they feel like it'll be a burden on their job. Some gatekeepers, they also mention, may also underestimate the competence of the children in their care, so they may feel like the children are not able to do the research or participate in the research. So they also mention the importance of cooperation with the gatekeepers in order to get access to the children in certain locations, and the importance of being respectful and mindful of the gatekeepers along with the participants, which is also something we need to keep in mind when designing and planning the research. Another type of consent would be community consent. So in certain contexts, a researcher may also need consent from community leaders. In particular places, certain parts of the world where the emphasis is really much more on the community as opposed to the individual. And if you have like a sort of a small, tight-knit community, you may need community permission for involvement of children in a research project. And, you also need to talk about consent with them. So the other two things we're going to talk about is issue of deception and coercion. So sometimes in research, deception is used, and this is where the researchers aren't completely honest with the participants. So for example, if you're really interested in studying aggression, but you don't want to tell the participants that you're studying aggression. So instead you say, this project is about video games. Well, I know, you're probably thinking, well, I thought we're supposed to give informed consent, and that doesn't really sound like it because the participant is not fully informed about what the research will be about. But this is where we have to go back and think about the principle of harm and benefit. So does the benefit of the research outweigh the harm of the deception? In this instance, maybe the deception is not really that big, and maybe the harm is not that significant compared to what might be learned from the project. Especially if at the end of the project, you tell the participants what the project was actually about. So say it was actually about aggression, and you tell them they can withdraw their participation or withdraw their data if they wish. So there are different ways we can handle deception that make it okay sometimes. Finally, we need to think about coercion. So in research, this basically means that somebody feels like they have to participate in research. So we have to be careful that the participants are not feeling coerced into participating. So for an example, if a teacher is asking students to participate in a project, they may feel as though they have to participate. And they might feel pressured into participating. So depending on the relationship between the researcher and the participants, this can sometimes happen. So next we're going to talk about compensation. So compensation can sometimes be seen as an ethical issue because some researchers are concerned about whether or not giving participants an incentive actually is kind of like coercion, because participants may participate only because they want to do it for the money or whatever the incentive is. So first we'll look at reimbursement. So reimbursement is where you give back the participant any costs associated with them participating in the research. It's not really that you're rewarding them for their participation, but for instance, if say they have to pay for parking when they come to do their interview, well then you give them back the money to pay for the parking, which is considered most of the time totally fine. Then there's also appreciation, and this is where you don't tell anyone ahead of time, but after the research project is over, you give them a little something to say thank you for participating in the research, and that is generally considered okay as well. It's like a token of appreciation and not really coercive. So for an example, in my project, when the children were finished participating, I had made them albums with the pictures that they had taken of the outdoor play space, and I had given them each their own album, as well as I created an album that they kept in the childcare center on the shelf. So that was like a token of appreciation. An incentive, however, is a little different. So an incentive is when upfront you tell the participants, okay, if you participate in this study, you'll either get like a gift card to Tim Hortons, or we'll put your name into a lottery and you'll have the chance to win, once again, say a gift card. Now the big question here is when does incentive become a bribe or coercive? So sometimes it's a bit tricky, and most folks are okay with, are comfortable enough with a small incentive. But this is the part where it sometimes raises ethical issues, so we need to think about what the incentive is going to be and whether it's okay or not. So the final big thing that comes up frequently in ethics is the question of confidentiality. So first of all, let's look at what the difference between anonymity and confidentiality is. So anonymity is when people participate in research and nobody knows who they are, including the research themselves. So for an example, if a researcher creates a survey monkey and sends it out to people, anyone can answer that survey monkey without providing any kind of information that will reveal who they are. So essentially the researcher won't know who the participants are. That would be considered an anonymous project. A confidential project is when the researcher does know who the participants are. So for an example, when you're conducting an interview, if you're a researcher, you will know who the participant is. Or if, say, you decide to do participant observation, you'll be in the same space as the participants, and essentially you'll know who they are. So confidentiality is about the researcher taking steps to protect the participant's identity from being discovered by others. So this means that the researcher needs to ensure that any of the information provided in the study cannot be connected back to the participants. So for an example, when the researcher is writing the final reports, they need to be sure that they build in procedures into the research to ensure confidentiality. So when someone reads that final report, they will not be able to identify who those participants are. So this can come up in various ways, and in some projects, even being seen as a participant can be an issue. So for an example, if you're doing a research project and you put out an ad or a call for participants on Facebook or Instagram, the Research Ethics Board will request that you add a comment in there explaining to the participants that anyone who responds to this will not be anonymous, and they're making it clear that they're potentially betraying their own confidentiality, because everyone else who sees that post will know that they were interested and potentially know that they might be involved in that specific project. Sometimes, in some cases, the participants are okay with that, but for some other projects, like depending on the topic, if it's kind of sensitive, participants might not want people to know. Some other ways we can keep information confidential is by using pseudonyms. So what this means is that we use fake names for the participants, or fake names for their schools, or fake names for their friends, or any name that's mentioned in the study. So in the project that I did with Rebecca that looked at children's experiences during COVID, we let the children choose their fake names. So whatever name that they chose, which wasn't their real name, we used that name even when we were transcribing the interviews. Anything that we wrote up with their names on it, we used the fake name so they wouldn't be identifiable. It is also important to think about how the data that you have is going to be protected. So once again, for the COVID project, all of the information was on our computers, so we used password-protected documents. And this is really important because if, for an example, you lose your computer or your computer is stolen, you need to be sure that the information in the computer cannot be opened by just anyone. So by keeping a password on there, you know that no one else will be able to open that document. Okay, so we're going to go over one last thing that is very important. And usually in the letter of consent, we guarantee confidentiality, as we were talking about earlier. We say that we will keep information confidential so no one knows, and we will not let people know what the participants said. We explain that the comments will be kept separately from the participants' names. But there is one exception to this, and we have to be really open about this exception. And that's that we have an obligation to report when a young person may be in danger. So if there's some kind of incidence of neglect or abuse, we have an obligation to report. It's very important that we need to make sure that this is also in the letter of consent, where it explains that we are obligated to report if we hear something that is concerning. So for an example, if somebody were to raise something concerning, we have to think about the context and where the child is at. And it's really important that we talk to the child first. But we do have an obligation to report what we've learned, and this is for the safety of the participant. So throughout this presentation, I've mentioned the Research Ethics Boards many times, and I've indicated that we have a Research Ethics Board at Brock University. So this board is governed by the Tri-Council Policy Statement, which is a federal statement about ethical conduct for research in Canada. So all universities have this Research Ethics Board. Any university in Canada does. And before anybody in a university does research, they have to submit an application to an ethics board and have them determine that the project can go ahead. And so sometimes this can take a little while, like a month or two, to go through the Research Ethics Board, depending on how complex the project is. The Tri-Council policy also includes particular attention if you're going to be doing work with First Nations, Inuit, or Métis people. So in a circumstance like this, there is a whole sort of like extra processes that you may have to go through at Brock. At Brock, the Research Ethics Board includes people such as some staff, faculty, as well as some other student representatives, and so on. So you'll be learning a lot more about this in 3P10 next year, and maybe even in 2P52 this year.